Dana White, one of the most powerful figures in combat sports, the face of the UFC, the king of trash talk, and maybe the king of BS? Over the years, Dana has made some wild claims, from saying fighters get paid very well to insisting Francis Ngannou was scared to fight, to covering up some of the biggest UFC controversies. We're breaking down Dana White's biggest lies and cover-ups, from fighter pay to shady negotiations, to fights that were never supposed to happen, and cheating to keep certain fighters at the top. Stick around because trust me, this one gets crazy. Chapter 1. The lie about UFC fighter pay. Let's start with the biggest controversy. For years, Dana White has claimed UFC fighters get paid very well, and that there's no issue with how much money they make. But here's the reality. The UFC only pays around 16 to 20% of its revenue to fighters. Compare that to the NBA, NFL, or boxing, where athletes get 50% or more of the revenue. Fighters like Francis Ngannou, Jorge Masvidal, and Jon Jones have all publicly called out Dana for underpaying them. Some UFC fighters literally have to work side jobs just to survive. And remember when Dana said, if you don't like it, go fight somewhere else? Well, fighters tried. And when they did, the UFC blocked them from leaving. More on that in a bit. Now, I know people will say this is public knowledge, but let's talk about something that wasn't public knowledge until Francis decided to make it public. Dana claimed Francis Ngannou was offered more than he made boxing. For context, Francis made $10 million. Francis came out and said this was a flat-out lie, and if Dana kept denying it, he would release proof. Dana stopped talking about it right after that. Let's talk more about Francis, because there is quite a few lies surrounding him. One of Dana's biggest public lies was about Francis Ngannou, the baddest man on the planet and the former UFC heavyweight champion. In 2023, Dana claimed Francis was scared to fight Jon Jones and that he left because he didn't want to compete at the highest level. Here's what really happened. Francis wanted to fight Jones, but he also wanted health insurance, better fighter, pay, and the ability to box. The UFC refused, so Francis walked. And what happened next? Francis went to the PFL, made millions, and boxed Tyson Fury. Dana tried to bury Francis, but the truth came out. Ngannou didn't run from competition. He ran from a bad deal. Francis was more than willing to post proof and express his disdain for Dana. Did Francis prove Dana White wrong? Yes. Did Dana try to destroy Francis' reputation to keep control over his fighters? 100%. Dana wanted to make an example out of Francis, to show other fighters that they can't leave the UFC and succeed. But Francis, he did the unthinkable. He left the UFC, got paid, and gained more respect than ever. The next egregious thing Dana White has done is block fighters from leaving. Dana White loves to say fighters can leave the UFC anytime if they're unhappy. But here's the truth. The UFC will do everything in its power to keep fighters trapped in their contracts. Fighters like Randy Couture, GSP, and Nate Diaz all had to fight through legal battles just to leave the UFC. The UFC even tried to stop GSP from fighting in boxing after he retired. And here's the worst part. If a fighter wants to leave, the UFC can just bench them. They can extend contracts indefinitely if the fighter refuses a fight. Funny enough, on the other side of it, if UFC does not like for any reason, they will make sure you never fight. Demetrius Johnson was treated awful by the UFC, even though he is one of the GOATs of the sport. UFC ended up trading him for Ben Askren. Yes, you heard that correct. One of the GOATs of the sport for the guy who got knocked out in the fastest in the sport's history. Now let's talk about the UFC 300 cover-up. UFC 300 was hyped for months as the biggest card in UFC history. Fans were expecting Jon Jones versus Aspinall, McGregor's return, Khabib coming out of retirement, wishful thinking, but still. And what did we get? Pereira versus Jamahal Hill. Now that's still a great fight, but the UFC knew it wasn't what fans expected. And instead of admitting they couldn't book a bigger fight, Dana just pretended like this was always the plan. The truth? Jones versus Stipe was supposed to be the UFC 300 main event, but Jon got injured, and the UFC had no backup plan. And when fans called Dana out, his response, "Don't watch it if you don't like it," the Dana White classic. Dana lied about UFC drug testing. For years, Dana White boasted that the UFC had the most rigorous drug testing in sports. But the reality? Conor McGregor got special treatment and left the USADA testing pool before his comeback. At UFC 200, Brock Lesnar made his return to MMA against Mark Hunt. The UFC hyped it up as the biggest fight in UFC history. But what they didn't tell us was that Lesnar had already failed a drug test before the fight even happened. Lesnar was given a special exemption from the usual 4-month USADA testing period. The The UFC knew Lesnar's test results were suspicious before the fight, but didn't announce it until after the event was over. When the results finally came out, Lesnar had tested positive for clomiphene, a banned substance used to boost testosterone. And the best part, Dana acted shocked. Meanwhile, Mark Hunt was furious because he fought a juiced-up Lesnar and later sued the UFC for letting it happen. But in the end, Lesnar got a 1-year suspension, but he never fought in the UFC again. The UFC kept their pay-per-view millions, and Mark Hunt, he got nothing but a brutal beating. So yeah, the UFC will absolutely let fighters compete even if they fail a drug test, as long as there's money to be made. Next up, we have Jon Picograms Jones, who might have the weirdest drug test controversy in UFC history. In 2017, Jon Jones tested positive for turinabol, an anabolic steroid, right after his head kick KO win over Daniel Cormier. The UFC stripped Jones of the title. He was suspended for 15 months. Dana acted like he was done with Jones. But here's where things get crazy. A year later in 2018, Jones was set to fight Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 232. But guess what? Another failed test. This time USADA found tiny traces of turinabol in his system again. But instead of pulling him from the fight, the UFC relocated the entire event from Nevada to California because Nevada's commission wouldn't clear him. And the explanation? Pulsing. The UFC and USADA claimed that Jones wasn't taking steroids again, but rather that old. Steroids were randomly pulsing in his system. No one had ever heard of this excuse before. And conveniently, Jones was cleared to fight. So yeah, other fighters get suspended for trace amounts of PEDs, but when Jon Jones fails a test, the UFC moves the entire event for him. I have an entire video talking about Jon Jones' favoritism, so if you are interested in that, click the link in the description. And then in 2023, the UFC dropped USADA entirely. Why? Because they wanted more control over testing. Since then, we keep hearing Conor is coming back when he is clearly coked out of his mind. Not only that, it looks like he is on steroids considering how much bigger he is compared to how he was before. He was supposed to have a fight that mysteriously got cancelled because of an alleged injury, but Conor was on his Instagram story, partying. So yeah, Dana's best drug testing in the world claim? Not exactly true. The only drug testing it might be better than is WWE. At the end of the day, Dana White is a businessman first, promoter second, and truth teller. Well, somewhere way down the list. From fighter pay to Francis Ngannou to UFC contracts, Dana hasn't always told the truth. But hey, that's what makes him one of the most controversial figures in sports. One thing I will give credit to Dana for is he stands on business. What do you think was Dana's biggest lie or cover-up? Drop a comment below. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe for more MMA deep dives.